It was a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent, and I was a mom in my early 30s who had just driven our kids to the pediatrician. The Georgia doctor's office was an hour away from home, and I was just taking the two youngest of my 3 kids, then ages 1 and 3 years old, to our scheduled appointment. Because we lived so far away, their office always gave us the last 2 appointments of the day, and we were grateful. The doctor had just built a new building off of a fresh spur of the highway, so the location was quite isolated in every direction, but a very nice facility compared to his old spot by the hospital there. His new buildings were also pretty far back on the new lot, and my car, a black Jeep Cherokee we had owned for 2 years, was one of 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot. When we got there, I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seat, and for the next hour or so we waited, then saw the doctor, paid, and finally exited back outside. Mine was the only car left in the lot as I loaded the children in their car seats for our trip home, but as the receptionist locked the front glass doors, my car somehow wouldn't start when I turned the keys. There was just an odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the door until someone allowed us back in and asked to borrow their phone to call a nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book, and the man said that he would come, but that it might be a while. So I told him my location, left to go back out to the car, rolled down all the windows, and loaded the children back into their seats once more as we waited. Soon we watched as all the lights were turned out in the building again, and everyone left, their cars departing one by one for behind the building somewhere, leaving us now completely alone in our parking lot. As it was still light, I spent a lot of that time trying to tend the children, digging throughout our car for snacks and a bottle, making sure that they weren't getting too hot. Although the service station attendant said that it was probably going to be a while, I was pleasantly surprised when a truck pulled into the empty parking lot pretty soon, and a man got out of his pickup, smiled and nodded to me, and said that he was going to raise the hood. He was middle-aged, a bit scruffy, but quite frankly many gas station attendants sometimes looked that way, especially at the end of the day, and I was grateful when he began doing something under the hood almost immediately. I sat down in the driver's seat with the door open, waiting for him to tell me to try the engine, but he seemed to be taking a long time checking the connections, and I longed for him to just grab my jumper cables, yet he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what he thought was wrong. He said, "Oh, it's just a loose wire, not the battery," and he continued whatever he was doing. I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through the long horizontal slit between the windshield and the raised hood as we waited. More than once he said that it was merely a loose wire, and if I would just come up here really quick, he could show me which one it was, so that it would never happen again. I remember kind of smiling and shaking my head, saying that sadly there was no reason to show me anything, as I didn't know anything about cars. I just thanked him and I continued to stay in the driver's seat, again just waiting for the inevitable signal to try to start the engine that was most surely coming at any moment. At one point I remember thinking he was definitely flirting when he would speak to me, but I was trying above all to be polite and kind, as he was indeed helping us. We were hot, tired, and miserable, and truthfully I was distracted with the kids. Oddly enough, he was starting to sound a little frustrated with me, because I wouldn't come up and look at the engine. I remember thinking that I certainly didn't want to make him mad, or he left us there all alone, with the sun sinking so quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into that desolate parking lot, and as it did, this nice guy working underneath my hood suddenly slammed it shut, ran to his truck and started it, and drove away very quickly, without even saying a word of goodbye. I was both confused and a little anxious when he did this, because I didn't know who was now arriving. I even remember feeling a little frightened that he had suddenly left me there all alone with 2 little ones, defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay and speak to whoever was parking next to me now? It certainly seemed like the southerly gentleman thing to do. I looked around and was very aware, once again, that there were no visible cars on the road, no homes, no businesses nearby, and the sun was continuing to set quickly. As this new, also unmarked pickup pulled up next to me, I got out of the car once again, this time more apprehensively. Upon exiting, though, he immediately introduced himself and his name and voice seemed to match who I had spoken with on the phone earlier. He then actually called me by name, apologized for being so late, and finally smiled and stared towards the road pointing and asked who that man was who had just left so suddenly. Relieved and unfazed, I just smiled back in surprise and I told him, "Well, I don't know. I thought all this time that he was you." We both laughed slightly as he grabbed my jumper cables, walked to the front of my car, raised the hood and started to work. I immediately sat back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that, with luck, that air conditioner would be blowing full blast shortly, and once again checking the children. While listening to the familiar words, "Try it," I had my back completely turned towards the children when he surprised me by suddenly coming to the driver's door. In the stranger's voice he said, "Ma'am, is this yours?" And when I looked in his hands, he was holding a long, thin, dagger-looking device that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered with reddish rust. Yet on one end, it had tiny circular, small finger holes, as if it was a mix of a long, thin sword and scissors oddly combined. I remember being amazed but not frightened, and I asked where he had found them. "Under the hood," he replied. I said just a matter-of-factly that I'd never seen that before. But how weird was it that those things had somehow been stuck and undiscovered in my car for all those years? And I shook my head in surprise. He continued to stand there and stare at them, unbelievingly, and he looked oddly pale too, like he couldn't find the words to speak for a bit, just continuing to stare at the unusual object. Honestly, I didn't care one bit about it. All I could think of was getting the car going, letting me pay him, and leaving. He didn't say anything else, just quickly set them on the curb, started his truck and then signaled for me to start the Jeep. And when my car immediately started, my 3-year-old cheered. Grateful, I quickly turned on the air conditioner full blast, rolled up all the windows, aimed the air vents back towards the back seat, and reached for my purse to pay out. I stood up and took a few steps to meet him, so I could hear the amount now owed. With both of our vehicles running, he came back around to my driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, irritated me a bit by walking right past me and picking up that weird object once more. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I want you to look at these one more time," and he held them out for a closer inspection. This time I moved a bit closer and actually really looked. In his hands the item still appeared incredibly large, possessing an almost bayonet-looking quality, except for the strangely small 2 loops on the end. I had never seen anything like it, and told him so. As he held it, he spoke slowly and quietly to me, as if trying desperately to make me understand something that was somehow still going over my head. "These weren't hidden somewhere in the engine, ma'am. They hadn't been there very long at all, because they were sitting right on top. They must have just been put there." I shook my head no and half smiled as I said, "But they're obviously very old and rusty." To which he pointed out more closely and replied, "Yeah, but see how sharp they are? These look like they have just been sharpened." And when I looked down, he was right. The long, skinny, dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest quality was just how sharp it appeared to be. The edges at the tip, where the rust had been removed, were gleaming silver. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "Ma'am, I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, told me that I probably needed to call the police when I got home, and then asked me where I wanted the item. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to take it at all, but I released the back window so he could place it inside. We both then left the lot together. He turned one way, me turning one towards the small winding highway that would lead home, still an hour away. I did indeed contact the police that moment that we arrived home, and I got the children inside safely. But although they listened politely, they declined when I offered to bring the dagger-like thing to them later. The officer I spoke to said they sounded as if they were specialized surgical shears, from my description and measurements on the phone, which I found quite disturbing, as you can imagine. I remember wondering, how would he even know that? Why would he say that? I had tried so carefully not to touch any of the surfaces, hoping that they might be able to lift the prints and test for blood if they wanted to, but the story seemed to bore him a little bit, and he didn't seem interested. His attitude insinuated that, as there was no longer an emergency, it was of no importance now. At the very end of the call, as if to wind things up, he did say that it sounded as if I was very lucky, and that I might want to keep the shears for a few days, just in case someone from his office got back to me later, but that was all. I wrapped them carefully in newspaper and placed them in the brick storage unit behind our house, and there they remained for several more years, untouched, until we moved away, and I finally, not wanting to bring them across several states, reluctantly threw them in the trash. Around that time, though, if you look through old news reports, women were going missing all over Georgia. Some bodies were eventually found, but others remain missing till this very day. I have often wondered what would have happened if the service station attendant hadn't arrived when he did, if my children would still have a mom, if I would still have my son and my daughter, if I would have missed all those years with them. I guess I'll never know, but I learned something very important about myself that day. I had always felt that I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading people and staying safe. But because I was exhausted and hot and tired and stranded in a different city, my common sense and intelligence simply left me for a bit and was not working at that time. And many of my friends and family still think that our car trouble that day and my lack of awareness could easily have cost us our lives. Alaska is the perfect place to go if you want to get away from the rest of the world. As America's least densely populated state, you have plenty of breathing room from any kind of authority or prying eyes that may want to know what you're up to. For this reason, my home state is very attractive to all sorts of weird and unsavory groups. I've stumbled across Scientology centers at the end of a dirt back road with nothing else for miles around. Heard stories from doomsday preppers who claim to have bunkers made out of shipping containers in the sides of mountains, and met people who have come out of religious cults in the interior that wanted to keep their followers away from contact with the outside world. All of this and more you can find in Alaska. I was born and raised in Anchorage, the only big city in the state. Growing up, we had about 25,000 people in a city. It takes about 30 minutes tops to drive across it, so that gives you an idea of what we would consider a big city. The only other real cities in the state is Fairbanks. These two cities are connected by 360 miles of a 2-lane highway. It's a 7-hour drive one way to get between them, through one of the most beautiful landscapes on the planet. Mountains rise up on either side of you between Anchorage and Denali National Park before you drive through these colossal canyons, carved out of the rocks over tens of thousands of years by melting glaciers and rivers. Past Denali is another 3 hours of driving through a vast, flat, interior plain with mountains in the distance. I say all of this to help you understand just how desolate it feels in the Alaska, even on the highway. After you get out of Anchorage and Fairbanks, there is nothing but wilderness as far as the eye can see, save for the occasional small town with max population about 1,000 people on a good day. 10 years back, it was even less. Alaskan girls are built tough. We change tires, we hunt, fish, camp, and generally have a great appreciation for the great outdoors that women in the lower 48 really don't have if they're near a city. The joke is that Anchorage is the biggest rural city in the country. All this brings context to the following story. In high school, things were different, or at least they felt different. I was young and stupid, who thought that I would conquer anything due to the aforementioned built tough attitude I was raised with. Senior year of high school, I decided to treat myself to a camping trip in the mountains up past Talkeetna. Nothing fancy, just an overnight or two in the most beautiful state at the most beautiful time of the year, mid-June. Going up north in peak summer has a weird feeling to it. The sun never really sets. If you've ever seen the movie Midsummer, that's what it's like. It gets to about dusk and that's it. It's still bright and sunny out the entire night through. The false sense of security I had, thinking that the midnight sunlight would mean safety, probably nearly got me killed, or worse. My second mistake was not telling anyone where I was going. I just packed up for my trip, stopped at Subway for a lunch, and headed out into the great beyond. The drive was fine. A solid 2.5 hours of driving north along the highway took up most of the afternoon as I jammed out to the greatest hits from the radio on Cool 97.3. After you get through the Matsu Valley, you get into the mountains again. Tall spruce and evergreen trees line the road on both sides, with the occasional empty space where there has been some clear-cut logging. All of this gives you a sense that while you're in the wilderness, you are still connected to civilization in some way. This led me to my biggest mistake, not staying at a state park campground. I was in high school with only a part-time job and didn't want to pay the $15 overnight camping fee and was way too scared to risk the fine, so I found a spot that looked good and pulled off the road. The map I got from my dad said there was an old mining site up a nearby mountain, so I decided that would be the best spot to head for an overnight. My logic must have been that it was awesome to spend a night in a mining ghost town or something. Pulled off the road and packed my backpack, put on some bug spray, grabbed my map and compass, and started off into the woods. Now, this hadn't been the first time I had done this. I've been on wilderness backpacking trips on my own with my dad throughout my childhood. I knew my orientation skills and had taken some wilderness survival courses at camp. I wasn't just some dumb blonde wandering off into the woods with no idea of where I was, or so I thought. A solid 45-minute hike up into the hills, and I finally made it to where the old mining camp was supposed to be. There was nothing there, just an old concrete foundation with some holes in it, and nothing else. I was very disappointed, but surprised at the outcome. I set up camp off in the woods, and set to building a fire for dinner on the concrete slab. Here you're supposed to set up cooking a ways off of your camp, just in case bears are nosy. The last thing you want is a 1,300-pound grizzly poking his nose into your tent, wondering why you smell like soup and s'mores. By this time it was getting late, about 10 p.m., but the sun was still high in the sky, and by the time dinner was over, it was nearly 11. I was starving, and I dug in. About an hour later, it was as dark as it was going to get, so I hunkered down in my tent for the night, confident that the overgrowth was private enough for whatever animals might come around then. I woke to voices in the distance and slow-moving crashing through the underbrush. My first thought was hunters. My dad and I had ran into a few on some campouts, so it wasn't uncommon. I relaxed and figured that they would just pass through without incident and closed my eyes again. That's when they found my fire pit. A man's voice cried out into the brightish forest. Who was camping on our property? I froze. I knew I had messed up and was getting up, grabbing my purse, and putting on my shoes so I could go apologize before I heard the man again. When we find you, you're dead. You're on private militia property, and trespassers get shot. That's when the whole situation changed. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just pack up my tent with some armed guy lurking around. I carefully put on my shoes, put my keys in my purse, and slunk away into the underbrush as quietly as I could. My thought was to slip away, wait until they got bored and left, then go back, pack up, and leave. I spent 20 minutes hunkered behind a log in the woods, barely in earshot, before I heard a second voice calling for the others. They had found my tent and were tearing it apart, going through my stuff. I heard one guy shout out, "Bed is still warm. The trespasser is a girl. She left her underwear." The first man shouted out, "Okay, fan out, find her. This girl thinks she can trespass and that there's not going to be hell to pay." At that point, I wasn't concerned that I had left my spare change of underwear in my bag, or that these creeps had found it. I needed to get out of there. Quietly, I made my way down the mountain for a good 30 minutes, tiptoeing and taking care not to step on twigs or make a ruckus. After the rustling and shouting of the men had faded quite a bit, I said screw it and I booked it as fast as I could in the midnight sun down the hills. I tripped and fell and got scraped up more times than I cared to remember. Finally, I made it back down the road, but much to my horror, there was no car. I knew I had come up or down the road from where I had been. I couldn't quite remember where I was at the time, but picked a direction and started walking. I rounded a corner on the road and I saw my car, and the two men standing beside it. They were armed and dressed in surplus military gear. I hid in the brush on the side of the road and watched. A while later, several more men appeared from the train that I had taken. They dumped all my stuff next to my car, hopped back on their ATVs and drove away. I went up to my car, careful not to be seen, and found a note on my dashboard. It read something like, "If we ever catch you on our property again, we will not hesitate to use force. Consider this a warning." I went back to start loading my stuff into my car, and noticed what they had done. They had cut up and destroyed all of my gear, probably as punishment for trespassing. Honestly, I'm thankful they did that, because I'm thankful that I didn't get shot. Ever since then, I have taken great care to camp only in designated camping areas. And to the weird Alaskan militia group, I know you weren't actually going to kill me, but nevertheless, I don't ever want to see you again. When I was about 8 or 9, my family took a trip skiing to a small resort a couple of hours from where we lived in Spain. The resort itself was a sleepy little town of about 400 to 500 people max, with a few small supermarkets and hotels, and not much else. Typically, we picked the worst time possible to embark on the trip, which we had been planning for a good few years. The night after we arrived there was a blizzard, and so we spent the first half of the week locked into the hotel. Although we were able to go outside for the remaining few days, we had little to do given that the slopes were shut. The story that I want to tell comes from those first few days locked into the hotel. Despite my parents' annoyance at the timing of the trip being a nightmare, myself and my sister, who was 11 months older, were having a fantastic time. Locked up in the mountains with nothing to do, we were able to spend our days running around the hotel, eating sweets and watching the TV in the lobby. I should probably mention at this point that the hotel was somewhat of a maze. The large bar and restaurant area where my parents sat each day reading was at the center of the hotel. A myriad of small rooms then connected to the bar area at random points, shooting off in different directions. These rooms often had no discernible function. Each one had the same mahogany interior, and they were full of couches, fireplaces, and antiques that allowed for great games of hide and seek. The rooms would often have offshoots themselves, connecting to new rooms which would then connect to yet more useless wooden caves. As such, it was possible to be 4 or 5 rooms away from the main hotel area at any one time without knowing exactly where you were or how to get back. At some point along the weekend, myself and my sister decided to play hide and seek. The hotel was almost maze-like. It was almost impossible to find the hider, especially if they moved. To this day, I'm certain my sister was a filthy little cheat. At one point in the game, I was just about to give up on searching for my sister, until I heard her voice from what sounded like a few rooms away. After successfully navigating the web of rooms, I emerged to find her sitting on a couch alongside a German man with gray hair, probably in his 60s if I had to guess. As soon as I emerged into the room, the man turned to me and told me he was taking my sister to the swimming pool and asked if I wanted to come. I remember immediately thinking that it was odd that there was a swimming pool that we hadn't heard of. My parents had been complaining that morning about how much TV we were watching, and so I was sure they would have taken us there if they had known about it. Besides, the hotel did not seem of the size to be able to host one. I told the man that I have to go ask my parents first, and told my sister to come back with me to find them. He immediately replied that I should go, and that he's taking my sister. I told my sister that she absolutely had to come with me, but excited at the thought of the swimming pool, she said she didn't want to. We began to argue, with the man taking my sister's side and encouraging me to go ask my parents' permission whilst he waited with my sister. I dug my foot in, telling my sister that our parents would be very mad if we went somewhere on our own. And after a few minutes bickering, she eventually gave in and came back with me, giving her assurance to the man that we would come back. Of course, when we told our parents, they were livid. My dad went back to the room to try and find the man, but with all the offshoots, and given that all the random rooms looked the same, it was almost impossible to be sure that we were in the right one. In any case, there was no sign of him. I remember my dad screaming at the hotel lobby that he needed a list of all male guests and their room numbers, but of course they wouldn't give it to him. We spent the rest of the trip by our parents' side, terrified of the thought of being locked into a blizzard with them. Thankfully, we never saw the man again. But the scary thing, we checked the lobby. And as we imagined, the hotel did not have a pool. This happened last night and the night before. And a little backstory. I live in a not safe area. The block I'm on is okay, but if you walk down my street a block or two, you could get shot, offered drugs, be mugged, so much more. When we leave our house, we head up a side street that gets us away from trouble. Like I said, my block isn't bad. We all get along here, mostly. We all get along here. Most people on this block are related to each other, but for my household. But even though we are strangers to the neighbors, they are all nice to us. The people right next door have dogs as well, as a few other households. Again, we are the odd ones out in that department as well. The dogs only bark when someone is out on our block that doesn't live here. I've always felt safer because of the dogs. I live in a home that's converted into a duplex. When you walk into the front door, you are in the entryway, and then across the way you see my apartment door. Then if you go up the stairs besides my door, you will find the door to the second apartment. The front door to the house has no locking mechanism at all. It's so that way tenants cannot lock each other out of the house. We can only lock the doors to our apartments. When you come into the entryway, a motion sensing light comes on. No one is currently living in the upstairs apartment right now, so at this time it's just me and my husband living in the place. 2 nights ago, the husband was in bed and I was up watching TV. I was all relaxed and thinking about going to bed soon. It was nearly 1 a.m. Suddenly I got this overwhelming, uncomfortable feeling. I felt hot and sick to my stomach, and I had the intrusive thought that I needed to get up and check the apartment door and make sure that it was locked. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't, so I got up to look. Just as I got there, I heard somebody open the screen door to the outer house. I looked, and the door was locked. Then I heard the actual door, the house, open, and somebody step into the entryway. I was terrified. I know that no one lives upstairs, and my landlord said he would let me know if somebody was moving in. We don't get visitors this late, or without a phone call first. Also, with this pandemic and social distancing, nobody should be coming over. And then I heard a click. I recognized the clicking sound as the sound that the motion light makes when it turns on. Then I hear a male voice say, "Oh crap," and the sound of somebody running out of the house. I was terrified. I stood there trying to process what just happened. From the time I heard the screen door open until a solid minute after the person ran out, I stood there, frozen in place. The neighborhood dogs were barking their heads off all night, and they only do that if somebody they don't know is around. I think that somebody who doesn't know that the house is a duplex attempted to let themselves in. The light, which is way too bright for that tiny entrance, came on, and I think it scared the person away. I woke up my husband and we called the cops. They said that since the person was not trying to get into the apartment, that they weren't coming out. The best they would do is drive by a few times. Yeah, real comforting. Last night I was up late again. The dogs were barking, again, like crazy. At a little bit after midnight I heard a noise. I muted the TV and I realized that somebody is pounding. Not knocking, but full-on pounding on the outer house door. Not my apartment door, thank goodness. I was freaked out. I wanted to go in and wake the husband up, but I thought better of it. There was a window beside the outer house door where he was knocking, and that window is our bedroom window. Because my husband was asleep and the lights were on in the living room, but off in the bedroom, I thought if I opened the door, the person standing on the porch hammering on the door would see the light and know that somebody was here, and I was afraid to let whoever was out there know that somebody was here. I sat there for over 10 minutes of banging. It was non-stop. I thought maybe it was the police, because of the call that I had made the night before. So I called the police and told them what was happening, and about what happened the night before, and about my phone call to them the night before, and asked if it could be the cops at my door. He looked into it and said that as far as he could tell, whoever it was not a police officer. He also said not to open the door. He said he was sending the police out, and if somebody was banging on the door, they would talk to them. And he said he would call when he knew what was going on. The banging stopped about 5 minutes after I hung up with the police dispatcher, but I never got a phone call, so I don't know if the police ever showed up. Tonight the dogs are already barking, and have been up for the past hour. My husband decided that I'm going to bed early and that he will stay up. I doubt I'll sleep anyways. I made him promise that no matter what he hears, he will not unlock that door and open it. I don't know what to do. Is it smart to not advertise the fact that we are here by not having lights on in the bedroom and not going to the bedroom door window to get a look at the guy? Or should we make it clear that people do in fact live here? And who knows, it could have been 2 different people here on 2 consecutive nights around the same time between 12 and 1 a.m. I just hope I never actually have to run into this person face to face.